So I'll just first do a quick introduction. I'm Brian Sensenig. I lead our vendor management organization within Conagra brand. And I'm excited to be here today to meet all of you and talk a little bit about our journey, what we've learned in governance of our outsourcing partners and where it's leading and where we're changing going into digital transformation and the digital era. So as we go through the presentation, I'll share some examples of what we're going through, what we've learned, and hopefully that will help bring out some questions and we continue networking outside of here. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Micheal Urban, I'm director with PwC Strategy and I split my career between consulting in IT and outsourcing, and half of my career has been with in supplier relations. And I was head of supplier relations, strategy, and innovation at Toyota Financial Services. So I'll intersperse some of that, those experiences in our discussion today as well. My colleague Boris.
Hey guys, good to be here today. Really good to actually meet some colleagues in the Chicago office, which for a consultant, I don't get to say that very often. My name is Boris Abezgauz. I'm a partner in our strategy business based here out of Chicago. A big part of what I do day to day is I help clients think about sort of their back office strategies, IT, shared services, finance, HR shared services, and what is the right operating model, what is the right strategy, what is the right sourcing strategy. So I really have the luxury to think with clients about not only what is our problems today, but what is our problems 3 or 4 years from now. And so it's been really interesting to reflect about the stuff that we've been talking about 2 or even 1 year ago and calling them emerging and asking, is this at the top of the hype cycle? Like, this is mainstream. And so we want to talk to you about some of this, as this stuff is becoming mainstream and every day, what does it mean for the profession of procurement? What does it mean for tower leads and how they manage their vendors, what's the expectations they should have, and really address about what's myth, what's real, what's fiction. Thank you. Good to be here today. So you guys have clearly heard a lot of these words. Any magazine, your Facebook feed, you name it, people talk about RPA, AI, digital. Probably digital and strategy are 2 more overused words in business today, right? But a lot of this actually becoming very real. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. And just one example, like risk sharing. And I don't mean like gain sharing, like if you miss an SLA, we're going to penalize it. I mean true gain sharing, we're tied to business outcomes. Here's to achieve it type situation. I would say it's part of every new deal we're seeing today. Like, this is the norm. Somebody asked a question about RPA earlier. People don't talk about RPA. People say, you will automate this much of the transactional work every year. Like, no conversation about it. This is the norm today. And I think we're going to continue that to be the case. I think it also creates a lot of complexity. We already started talking a little bit about agile and how do you contract for agile? Like, do you have to go back to the traditional T&M model, or is there more, say, innovative ways to think about that, and again, tie to outcomes and to business value, and how to get stakeholders aligned around that? So that's really what we want to talk to you about, and really say what we believe you should be doing, what we're seeing other companies do today, versus maybe what's a little bit more bleeding edge. But 3 years from now, you got to be ready to do it. So you have to start the journey now to get there. By the way, in case you don't believe my word chart, here's some data. I really like that first chart. And measures outsourcing growth rates, right? Not outsourcing revenue as market, but it's a growth of outsourcing. And for the last 10 years, not surprising, that growth really slowed down. We've seen it in outsourcers' results. Like, they had the business. A lot of people went on to outsourcing journey. It was very steady state, so low growth rates. We're actually now seeing an uptick in the growth rate again. And at first glance, it could seem surprising, because why would that be? We're talking about automation. Transactional work should not be done by people or outsourcers regarding where they sit. Why is this the case? I think there's a short-term event there that, quite frankly, a lot of companies will pay outsourcers to help them go on their digital journey. And in fact, we see that in chart number 2, that there's more of the services are digitally focused. But I think there's another element in play. I think what we really see is that the outsourcers have all recognized a lot of transactional activities are being commoditized even further and being automated away. Nobody wants to pay for something that can be just automated. So they're moving upstream, and we'll talk about a little more what that means, in providing services they haven't traditionally offered. And I think we've seen a lot of investments. I don't think we've seen a lot of that materialize yet. But as all of you probably every time you talk to your vendors, you say, we want more innovation, more ideas, bring more to the table. I think they're making a lot of investments to go there, and this will translate into commercial opportunities. Michael, I want to talk a little bit more about what it means to source digitally.
What does it mean to source digitally? Well, I think it's important for us to first define, what is digital? I mean, this is inspired by a discussion I had last night, a really good discussion over a drink, where people are, questioning, what is digital? What is this thing? Is it automation? Is it big data and so forth? So I'm going to present a viewpoint on what digital is. And I would say it starts with 4 main technologies and then the how. Those 4 main technologies, cloud. So if I'm going to be a digital company, I need to be able to scale very quickly, whether I'm a small company and I'm going to grow and become a big company, whether I'm a huge traditional, large insurance company and add some new functionality, I need that to scale. I need that to scale with a cloud type technology. Then it goes to big data and analytics. So how do I create that big data model that's going to predict the outcome? And that comes from the big data and analytics, what that's bringing there. Then it goes to automation and intelligent automation, artificial intelligence. So if I can predict the future, I need to be able to trigger, based on that prediction, I need to be able to trigger some sort of intelligent action. And that's where artificial intelligence comes in. And then lastly, it's the Internet of Things, mobility. But we all know the power of a network. That's why we're here today, right? Networking. Same thing for this technology. If I can have all these devices talking to one another, that power is huge. And so when I bring these technologies together and I also change my how, that's digital, right? So I have the scale, I have the big data analytics, I now have artificial intelligence making my decisions for me. I'm leveraging that technology network, Internet of Things, and I'm delivering it in a very iterative way. And then that comes together. That's how I create Facebooks, the Amazons, the Googles of the world. Those are the digital companies. And I don't have to be a startup to be there. I can be a very traditional player that's adopting this technology, bringing these things together to create a business model that, quite frankly, will destroy other traditional business models, right? And it's such a huge wave. It's such a big power when I bring these things together that I am now just changing the industry, changing the way we buy things, the way we service things. And so digital's, it's hyped. Yes, I absolutely agree with that. But it is also, it's here and it's not going away. And it is going to change our industries. And so if it changes our industries, it changes our businesses and companies that we work at. It changes those companies that change what we buy. And that's where we get into digital outsourcing. So Boris, you asked me what digital outsourcing is. It's that, how do I outsource in this digital world? What is changing with my digital outsourcing? And so you can see the growth Boris, myself, and others we're all experiencing in the outsourcing world, and this is where it's coming from.
Thanks, Michael. And team, I guess I should have said this at the front. So we have a pretty tough act to follow after John. I think they did a great job of getting the room involved, so please, if you have any questions, raise your hand. We want to make sure this is as interactive as possible, and hopefully this is a good discussion. Any questions or comments on this, or should we keep going? I think most people know this and they've seen this before. Not surprisingly, like this didn't happen overnight. I think people sometimes portray that this is just all this technology just came out of nowhere. Like we have been on this journey for years, right? And whether you think about the optimization journey and trying to drive the productivity journey, right? Going back to the early 90s, people started centralizing and building shared services in-house just to drive those efficiencies and address bad processes and leverage best practices, right? A couple of years later, we said, okay, we can pull the labor arbitrage lever, whether you outsource, you build a captive. We started seeing these functional, low-cost centers. I think today, kind of the global business services model, I want to say it's not just common, it's prevalent, where people have multifunctional, multi-competency areas together with, I would say, global process owners. I think that's sort of the norm, and these process owners will drive automation through the processes that they own. The question is, where do we go next? And I think, and clearly a big focus of our conversation is, we believe, yes, the back office is going to get further digitized and automated, and the number of people will be required to run the back office will be less than ever before. But we also believe that what's unlocked and the benefits unlocked, both in the back office and front office, will also be bigger than ever before. And I think with that, I'll just kind of put strategy on hold, if you will. And Brian, maybe you can talk a little bit about how Conagra went on this journey and where you are today.
Yeah. So thanks, Boris. So from Conagra perspective, we followed a very similar path. We historically have been a captive shared services organization. We created primarily in Omaha, Nebraska, where we were headquartered prior to moving our headquarters to Chicago a couple years back. And on top of being captive, we also did some staff aug, dabbled in that, and whether it was a legacy application support that we needed or seasonality peaks or M&A activity, we bring in some staff aug. And then back in 2015, we started our, really just transformed their shared services group and went to full outsourcing. A little bit behind maybe some of our competitive set in our space, but we felt that, we had best-in-class practices. We had low costs, being in Omaha compared to some other parts of the U.S. And when we embarked on that journey, it was all about really getting cost savings, getting the reductions to be more competitive, reduce our SG&A. And what we've realized from the last 4 years outsourcing, we did get the cost savings. We got the labor arbitrage that everybody talks about and some of the percentages you can see up here that people get. But what we really ended up seeing and what we learned through it is we got better operationally. We had services that were not well documented, so we got much better documentation of our services. So operationally, we're performing a lot better. And we are now at the same as the curve shows up here, is looking at how, as we're looking at wrapping up our first initial contract, we're calling it our next gen contract. How do we transform that so we can be more enabling some of the digital functions? How can we look beyond just some of the tactical execution and basic back office support and take it more to an end-to-end approach? We do a great job executing at individual tower levels, but we're looking to how can we expand that and provide more of an end-to-end and even take some of it from the back office up to the front office to even eliminate some of the tasks and things that we do before they even happen. So that's a little bit about our journey.
Sure. So Boris asked earlier about digital outsourcing, traditional view of outsourcing, digital outsourcing view. So I think we're all in this room. We've experienced the digital traditional view of outsourcing where I have application maintenance, I have infrastructure, I might have some back office functions, but you have the transactional layer at the bottom, right? And that's where my outsourcers will sit. Decision support, that kind of goes more to the advisors, will help me out with that. Even advisors will be at that strategic level in my C-level room. And I've experienced this firsthand while I was head of supplier relations at Toyota Financial. What we're seeing is this digital outsourcing is these outsourcing companies. 15 RPA was at the beginning of the hype cycle, right? And I brought the on-site account manager from our company that we partner with. I brought him into the meeting room with the CEO to talk about RPA. And this was kind of the first time where the CEO is meeting with this large outsourcing company, right? And so that has done nothing but grow and grow. So what we're going to see is a lot more of these outsourcing companies move their way up to that C level. Because why? It's the same thing I said before. As digital becomes important, that has to be a CEO agenda item, right? And so he or she is going to be working directly with the people that know. And if you're a large traditional company, you're going to be leveraging these outsourcing partners to help you get there. And so they need to be a part of that boardroom. And so what we see is the evolution with that red is the outsourcer person at that strategic level and kind of those C-level discussions to help make that journey happen. The other thing that you'll see is at the bottom of the transactional level is the bots, right? maybe we have RPA fatigue. I get it. But the reality is that they are there doing the transactional volumes. Why do we get so much savings from infrastructure outsourcing contracts? Because we have a lot of bots in those environments, and they're taking the place of what typically the humans would be doing. They're also making the decisions. So even at the decision support level, I can now predict what's going to be happening, and so therefore I don't need as much support with with the humans and the advisors and so forth. So in theory, this is what we're seeing happening, or what we're forecasting to happen. But the reality is it's already happening today to some extent. And so, Ryan, you want to talk about your experience with the changing in the outsourcing models?
Yeah, so we're seeing a similar trend, but it's coming really more from the innovation centers of our outsourcing partners, more so than coming from the actual delivery centers and our teams who are performing our services today for us. But we have the bots in place for specific spot or pointed solutions within our BPO contracts. But what we're not seeing really is the transformational change and the really driving it beyond just a spot solution. So, we have was there a question? We have an interesting example. We had our strategic partner want to invite a bunch of us to their innovation center to talk about all their digital capabilities and how they believe they can help transform our business. And we went on this meeting a couple months back, and there are a lot of great technology to show us, a lot of great innovative solutions, but it was all around how they can get more revenue, new business opportunities. And our number one question that we asked is, well, have you deployed this in our core base business? Because we like to see how it works. Then we can take those successes and expand it out to other business partners within our business and expand beyond our traditional services that we've outsourced. And they all looked at each other like, no, this is a different model. We don't share this with our delivery teams. This is something we use and we sell, and it's not part of what you bought with your BPO services. So we stepped away from that meeting, reconvened internally, had a lot of discussions. And a couple months later, they come back to us and they're like, can we get back together and have some follow-up on all the discussion we had? And we said, yeah, but we're going to change the approach this time. If we're going to make that investment, a lot of their innovation centers, at least ours that we worked with, is out on the West Coast. We said, if we're going to make that investment to fly a bunch of people out, do a 2-day workshop, we want to make sure it's all around innovation that you guys can bring to our core services. We want to see the successes of what you're saying. Sounds great, but we need to see it in practice. Want to see it deployed and and get the benefits from it. And then we're open up the doors to all of our stakeholders where it makes sense to deploy these other or similar solutions. And we like, yeah, we'll do that. And then we're planning everything before we get out there. And I followed up and I said, now, did you invite our tower leads from your delivery centers that are running the services today? No, they don't come to these sessions. This is just a session for us to brainstorm and throw ideas. And we said, we're not going to go. We said, we're not going to go if we're not going to have a fully integrated team that can generate ideas and not just be pie in the sky, throw a bunch of stuff, see what sticks on the board, but be able to walk out of that 2-day workshop with what are the opportunities, how do we go action it, and let's put some timelines on it, and let's determine what the success criteria is going to be. So long story short, fast forward, we got they brought the tower leads. A lot of red tape to bring folks from the delivery centers to their innovation center to work with us directly. But it was a huge success. We broke out into various workshops. We took each tower, so we had procure to pay, record to report, order to cash. We had a mixture of our tower leads from Conagra, who own the services. We had our delivery leads from our outsourcing partner, who runs the services in the delivery centers. And then we had innovation architects, solution architects from our outsourcing provider that are based in their innovation centers. And what came out of that was eye-opening. One, the ideas definitely came out, and that was great, a lot of collaboration. But was eye-opening for me is when we got down to putting it into actionable items and aligning on what the outcome is going to be, which is an elimination of a lot of resources. And in some cases, like our procure to pay, with some tools and some investments we made, we're expecting to go down to maybe even 1 or 2 people to handle exceptions, but drop the whole service and just have it be fully automated. And we call it Lights Out Payables 2021. And the tower lead from our delivery center was just sitting in his chair. He was talkative the whole time until we got to that discussion. And then he squirmed and he was like, we only have 22 people doing procure to pay today. How we're going to go to 1 or 2? I was like, I don't even know if we need 1 or 2. Maybe those can just come back to the Conagra folks to figure out how do we reset the bot or reset the process to eliminate those exceptions from ever happening. And it was funny, we had a break, and I reported into our global business services VP. She was in a different session. She was in the order to cash session. And when I had a break, she came out, she ran over to me, she goes, I finally figured it out. I was like, let me guess, because I think I figured it out too. The reason why the last 4 years we haven't got any significant transformation, there's no incentive in the contract that we built. When we built it in 2015, we thought we had the best contracts. We worked with a great group of consultants, and we did have a great contract at the time with what we've done. We've got the labor arbitrage, we got committed productivity, we got all kinds of things in the contract that we are managing and we're achieving. But we expected we were going to get transformation. We got reduced costs, but we thought we'd go beyond that. We'd eliminate costs, not just reduce it, but eliminate it. And it wasn't until we were in that moment where we got everybody together did we realize, I mean, it sounds like, okay, that wasn't that big of an epiphany, but it was for us because we're like scratching our heads like, why aren't they doing more of these things? They're putting these bots in, but they're doing these little isolated one, like eliminating a small, little tiny process. They're not looking end to end. And there's just no incentive for them to do it. So we definitely are sitting back, and we'll talk about it in the next slide, is looking at our vision of how do we change our contract. We don't have to rip it completely up, but there's pieces we're going to have to reconstruct to drive the right behavior. But that's just a little bit of example of what we're seeing. We're seeing it. I think they're aspiring to do everything we're talking about, but they're doing it to get more increased revenue and new revenue work streams. And we're trying to do that, but first make sure we can get a good business case and see it realized in our core business.
So guys, just a mini survey by show of hands. How many of you have had an outsourcing partner approach you to get time with sort of somebody in your executive team, right? Head of marketing, head of sales. Yeah. How many of those meetings actually went off and were successful versus bombed? Successful? No, not a single hand. There's like just roughly maybe about 10 hands that went up for who said who wanted to join. No hands just went up when it said successful. I think that's a challenge. I think a lot of times, especially if you're in the procurement profession, part of your job is to also be sort of to guard the door, if you will, right? Make sure that the time is well spent, it's productive. The vendors embarrass themselves, quite frankly. And I think, not to say that this needs to change, I think you still have that responsibility, but I do think you now have an added onus on your job is to help the vendor be successful. Because whether the example Michael said about back in 2015, driving innovation, he had to partner with large system integrators and put in front of the executive team to say, here's what innovation could look like. But I think more and more, both all the outsourcers, whether Indian heritage firms or U.S. firms, are investing so heavily into industry-specific solutions that, and they're putting so many resources behind it, they will have solutions that are relevant to your front office organization that, quite frankly, very few companies may have the resources to scale to build their own. I'm not saying it's there and it's mature. I do think it is coming. Just if you look at the level of investment is there, that investment either going to be all written off or it's going to be productized. And I think even if today you focus mostly on managing the back office and managing that relationship with an outsourcer, there's a big both. It's a negotiating position, but it's also an opportunity. It's a strong make relationship stronger. Say, let me help you have the right conversation and a relevant conversation with our front office executives. Make sure you're bringing the right ideas to them versus just let's have a meeting and have a relationship meeting. Any questions or comments, or maybe if anybody else wants to share any stories about trying to get innovation out of your outsourcing partner.
So I really liked a tool story earlier about the incentive that you put into the contract and drive that business outcome, the third. And so this slide kind of talks to some of that, being more what you see at the bottom. I don't think anyone in this room is doing ad hoc contracting, or it's always typically right now what we see in the industry, a blend between basic and active. But how do you move to more of a proactive supplier management? What you see coming down on this table with a whole bunch of words is just your typical governance functions, right? And so what we're doing, we're just comparing the basic active to what that future is, that proactive. And so when we look at things like service management, everyone, I'm sure we're all very familiar with creating a great service catalog with your outsourcing partners, and I'm going to have them provide these services. What we see happening in the future is looking at more of those capabilities. So as that outsourcing company moves to the business partners and they're starting to work with them on business outcomes driven, and they start working with the CEO on that digital agenda, you're going to see much more of the capabilities. How do I add this functionality to my website? How do I add this predictive metrics into my website as well? Performance management. How do I start using some of these predictive metrics in some of my contracts? I'm sure everyone has these contracts that have, incident management, resolution, mean time to resolution, all those type of metrics, all very month-end, retroactive, looking at those. But how many people actually have metrics in there to predict that incident never happens? How do I start measuring my suppliers to be really good at predicting that the server never goes down, and using and deploying these predictive tools that are out there and leveraging those tools? And so we'll start to see those embedded into those reports, so that if I'm day 15 and through the month, and I'm gonna there's a prediction of some sort of outage, that they're actually seeing that to make sure it never happens in the first place. Contract management, it's all about business outcomes, right? So as I move from that traditional back office outsourcing provider to something more in the front office, working with my business partners, helping drive that digital agenda, I need to start putting in contract management that functions. They're actually managing those business outcomes. And so I, as like the governance function, I will be putting in those business outcomes in there, and that should be a part of my contract. Relationship management, right? And so I'm guilty of this, and I don't even know if it's something to be ashamed of, but having a very structured, this is my supplier executive, and they're going to square off with this executive in my company and IT group. This is my on-site manager, and they're going to square off with me in my old life. Very binary square off, right? But as I start to bring in the business, bring in the executives, I have to start thinking about innovation. So who is squaring off with, it's what I call as multifaceted. Who's squaring off with my innovation side here, right? I might have somebody that's leading an innovation group. Who's facing off with my business partners and so forth. So very multifaceted relationship management that I should be facilitating in my organization. Compliance, that would be a very big thing as well. How do I start assessing that risk and making sure that compliance has a seat at the table? Demand management. So typically I collect a whole bunch of requirements and I have this scope and I go through this big, large outsourcing project that took me 6 months, right? But as I start to use outsourcing partners for doing Scrum and so forth and delivering in an agile management manner, how do I scale up those teams in a very quick manner? How do I add additional Scrum teams very quickly, and how do I flex in, that scope with those teams? And then financial management, I think we're going to start seeing where it's kind of like I close the books. This is my spend with the supplier. It's not going to change. As they are working in a more agile way and they're increasing their Scrum teams, their finances are going to increase. It's going to impact my budget. It's not something that's set in stone. So how do I incorporate that into my KPIs that I may look at on a monthly basis? And so I think we'll start to see that. Brian, I'm interested in hearing what's your kind of experience with some of these theoretical changes that we were predicting to happen.
Yeah. So I would say, Conagra, we aspire to be at the proactive supplier management maturity cycle, but we're not there yet. We created a vendor management organization to put governance in place when we decided to do full full-fledged outsourcing back in 2015. So I'd say we're probably in the middle between the basic and active. I said some things we're doing are probably more on the active side, and there's some things we could do better that we're still haven't really spent the time and the energy in. We also have to continue to evolve our skills of our team too, on how to, shift over to the proactive supplier management phase. And I think we build a pretty good disciplined governance structure. We do the operational, functional governance, as we talked about earlier this morning. Great job reporting on SLAs and scorecarding. I think we nailed that one. We have good tight controls over that. But we really want to shift more to how do we prevent any of those misses from occurring? How do we get better visibility into how we're delivering on those services from a day-to-day perspective? And we go through what we call a strat plan at Conagra. It's just a 3-year outlook and plan of what are the steps and where do we want to be in 3 years and how do we get there along the journey? What are some of the goals that we put in place? And one of the goals that we listed down is to get to a proactive supplier management maturity of our partners. And some of the things that we wrote down that we want to accomplish is some things are simple. Some of you guys may already have these, but we have a lot of manual reporting. So to get to that functional governance and get to the dashboard of all of the SLAs, there's a lot of people involved in turning the cranks and spitting out different reports from different systems. I heard somebody, I think it was Abbott, had 150 ERP systems, so I don't even know how you manage all the data coming out of that. We have a couple based on different businesses that we manage, but it's just a lot of work turning that crank, getting all that data. And what do you get? At the end of the day, you're halfway into the next month, and you're just reporting the old news that people already knew because they're pissed off because the services weren't delivered on time or to the quality that they wanted. But we do a great job doing it, and I keep telling my team, we got to shift beyond being the reporters to how do we prevent? How are we the prevention office? And whether it's good news or bad news, how do we deliver that up front instead of running in and telling everybody, hey, here's our chart. It's either green, red, or yellow. We don't know, but it's 6 weeks behind, right? Nobody cares. So we're looking to automate our workload drivers, automate our reporting. We are working actively on putting together electronic dashboard, leveraging Power BI and some other tools, so that way we can see the data real time. We can connect into the different tool sets that we get through APIs and other ways to automate that. So if we're looking at record to report or we're looking at order to cash, where are we today? If we're at workday 10 of our fiscal period or month, how are we performing? Are we at risk? Do we believe we're at risk of not meeting the end of the month, whatever that metric or goal is, because of how they're performing day 10 now versus day 10 same period last year or last quarter? So we believe that's going to help us, lead more to being proactive. We're also looking at, and talk about automating the workload drivers. We're looking at creating a tool to forecast and predict when we have an acquisition or we have a divestiture, what do we think, and we have our workload drivers and our dead bands and our ARC and our ROOK tables, what do we think that's going to do to the business if we either eliminate something or we increase the business for various reasons? So we're working on predictive analysis tools. We're also trying to get to, as I mentioned, the dashboard, just more of those proactive alerts. How do we communicate and have that dialogue with the supplier that there's trust, and we can just see where the gaps are before the gaps occur, whether that is need more resources, whether it's need more training. How do we get that tighter governance, that tighter trust, that we're not here just to hammer you on missing the SLAs. We're trying to prevent you from missing it. At the end of the day, I don't think anybody in here, if you have service level credits, want to get them. They're a pain for us to deal with. We get managed, the success for us is not having any of them, because we don't, we want the service delivered as we asked for. So those are just some things we're doing, aspiring, trying to get to proactive supplier management.
Thanks, Brian. Any questions on this or any comments?
But one of the elements I would have thought you might have in here is risk management. Do you not see that within governance? Do you see that sitting somewhere, or how do you integrate that in this piece?
Yeah, so talking about the supplier, like third-party risk management. Yeah, so a lot of our risk management is and they're doing a lot of assessments on controls around data. So we partner with them, but we don't own the third-party risk management within our vendor management group. But we do own if there's any follow-ups, action plans, but in terms of the process and identifying where there's gaps, we partner with our security team.
No, Atul, absolutely. It has to be part of a holistic governance approach, regardless where it sits.
So kind of piggybacking off of Atul's question. So what would your recommendations be for then proactive, risk management?
Yeah, so Boris and I actually had this discussion a few weeks back about, there's going to be another slide on here about innovation, right? And so if we think of a definition of innovation, execution of new things, right? And so, traditionally we see like what kind of skills do you have on your team? Maybe we just go to that slide. This is the next one. Yeah, so we'll just go to this slide. Typically you see the traditional value player, right? That's typically supplier relations, procurement, trying to get the best SLAs, very important function. And with digital, we see this needing additional skill sets, or what we're calling archetypes, of course. And one of those is the innovator. And what Boris and I were talking about is what's the skill set of an innovator? Well, assessing risk is extremely important to any innovator, right? So you can't just be, from my perspective, a pie in the sky, great idea kind of person without figuring out how to get that done. Typically, how you get that done is by assessing the organizational risk of the idea, right? And navigating through those through those waters, right? Obviously risk management extremely important. We often will see these 100 questionnaires about, does the supplier do this? Does the supplier do that? Will you be managing this? And they're all kind of equally weighted. But I think it was Andy that was talking about it earlier, as far as how do I, if the CEO decides I want to do this activity, how do I assess the risk of that activity, knowing that I probably answer no to a lot of those questions on that questionnaire? And so, but how do I accept that level of risk? And so what we see is one of those archetypes that's very important to the digital era is having that innovator that can assess that risk. Do you want to elaborate?
No, I think talent is hugely important in this discussion. I think another perspective is, look, I think a lot of people think about risk. They say, okay, here's a new process. Let's design the controls for this process. Let's test those controls once a year. That's risk management, at least in a traditional sense. I think as you think about how do you go proactive, you have to start thinking about how do I, first of all, instead of testing my controls once a year, test them continuously. And I think technology allows you to do that. I think you have to start proactively trying to break the controls to put in place and see if it's going to work or not. Especially kind of, and I'll say, throwing a curveball at your vendors every now and then and see how they deal with them, so they can do that in a controlled environment versus waiting until something really hits the fan.
I think just to add to the conversation, I think the best industry in risk management that's proactive is banking and financial services. The Office of the Controller of Currency requires them to have a monitoring program and to have actually a continuous monitoring program now. It used to be monitoring, now it's continuous monitoring. And I think this is an area where hopefully they're not in the room, but I think the old supplier data companies like Hoover's and B&B and LexisNexis, I think they're so far behind because they really focused on this one-time assessment. And the reality is risk needs to be continuous in real time. So I'm sorry for this plug, but you got to look at something like Supply Wisdom, where you truly move, but you truly move from a spot assessment to ongoing. One of the reasons companies are actually missing out on assessments is because it's a very expensive process. And as data, security, cyber have been added to it, what used to be 100, 200 questions is now 800, 1,000, 1,800 questions. And you effectively can't do that for 10,000 or 20,000 suppliers. So I think we also need, as part of governance, we ought to have a system in place or methodology where we're constantly assessing which risk level, which risk tiers do our third parties really belong to. So if we need to put it at 800 or 1,000, we can do it for the top 4 or 5% at best maybe. The rest don't need that level of risk management. But that's a discipline that really we haven't brought yet to the sourcing world.
Great point.
I met with a client in Europe. A couple weeks ago, and they were talking about this risk and how important it is, and the impact to them not only in Europe but also here in the United States due to things like the Dodd-Frank Act and so forth, is the working capital requirements for a bank. It's so the penalty for non-compliance or for this increased risk is that they have to have more working capital on hand, less putting it to work. So banks are highly regulated not only in Europe but here in the United States, and compliance is becoming a real key driver for risk and being able to manage and mitigate risk. But more importantly, it's also starting to hit more of corporate America and other industries. You know, the life sciences industries are regulated by CFR 21 Part 11. They love to whip out the CFR 21 Part 11, but you know, there's actually increased governance requirements for the governing bodies that like the International Accounting Standards Board and the Federal Accounting Standards Board. All these things are not getting easier; they're getting more and more complex, and there's not as much, you know, penalties in terms of for non-compliance, but they come in different forms as well. And there's a lot of money left on the table first and foremost from this, but on the risk side, there's compliance that's going to just keep getting more and more difficult to manage, external compliance with federal entities and international entities.
No, I think the cost of doing business in those areas is going to continue going up.
Okay. Yeah, I think what I often hear is we talk about risk in general, but there's really so many parts of risk that needs to be addressed, right? A little bit closer to home for us, and I absolutely agree with what Atul is saying, is you need to understand your performance risk, you need your contractual risk on the suppliers. That's something that needs to run perpetually. It needs to be, a system should tell you that almost every day as to the performance of the customer, not meeting obligations, that kind of stuff. That's one type of it. Then there's the external risk, then there's the financial risk. All of these things need to be looked at, and it's not a risk organization anymore that can do all of that. They need to be the people who collect it, and the systems need to integrate and provide all that information, because there's so many aspects of this that needs to be looked at, and it requires different tool sets and different ways in which you get there. So it comes down to how you select your technology and how your technology talks to each other to make sure that all that stuff is rolled up into one in the end.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, Claude, this is something CISOs across the board have been working for years. And how do you go and have a conversation with the board about the risk, cost, value equation? And what is the degree of risk we're prepared to take versus what is the cost we're going to invest to mitigate that risk and monitor it? And I don't know anybody who says that they figured it out, right? I think we all understand the equation, but it continues to seesaw, quite frankly, based on what Wall Street Journal reports around what was the latest indiscretion that happened and how much did that hurt.
You know, one of the things you're seeing in the banking industry a lot is you're seeing the regulators come about, and what they're saying is that you have to have a sourcing strategy now, but your strategy has to be connected to your business strategy. So when you have the verticals, while we are trying to pull them together, you have the different business units. Well, they each have different business strategies. Their sourcing strategy and ultimate risk appetite needs to be consistent with the business strategy. And we're starting to see this trend happening, so you can't dictate a risk appetite at a corporate level or board level anymore. It has to be at the business level. And it has to be flexible. The other thing is, while we're going through, and I know we have about 15 minutes left, but you know, one of the things we should maybe talk about a little bit about is scope creep, and you know how these growing relationships as we move into value add, we move into the future. How are we going to deal with this consolidation and how that impacts risk, governance, and so on? So, if one of you could just comment on that one also.
So let us actually think it's a great tee up actually for this slide. As you move into agile development and you move into sort of, I'm going to contract for something where I don't know the exact scope, I don't know the exact requirements, not sure on the exact outcomes, and I want it in contract, done on time.
Yeah. I think exactly what Boris is saying. You have this new way of delivering services, right? I mean, we're all familiar with agile, right? But what do I really manage with agile contracts? It's very easy to say, well, it's just a T&M contract, but that's not the best method for it, right? It's all about capturing that value realization. And so as you're in the governance function and you're managing these suppliers and you're managing these agile contracts, it's all about value realization. So when we look at the risk and so forth, it's, did I get the value from this contract? And so as we in governance have to move from, I spent 6 months collecting all my requirements, got the contract as a perfect contract, reviews, moving to a world where I should be managing the suppliers. I don't know my requirements, right? And but I still need to put governance on there because there's still risk with these contracts. And so what I start doing is I get involved in the stand-ups. I get involved in the demos. I have that technologist on board that can assess that quality. I'm familiar with my business outcomes that I'm trying to realize. I'm seeing if I'm realizing those business outcomes. And more importantly, I'm just going to be repetitive here. It's about, did I get the value? And if I got the value, I reward those companies with those scrum teams that are realizing the value. I disincentivize those companies by not rewarding the ones that are not realizing the value. And so I'm involved throughout the entire process. I'm there at the stand-ups and so forth, making sure I got that value.
And I think just to add to that, sort of, as you think about, you see sort of the agile waves or sprints, kind of after every sprint, right, you assess what is the minimum viable product, and you have to assess the risk associated with that along the way. And you're going to have to start making decisions that, okay, is this moving me towards the business outcome that we all said we want to try to strive for or not? And if the answer is no, or yes, but with the it also adds a level of risk that we're not prepared with, you kind of have to say, okay, let's slow this down, pull this back, and maybe go a different direction. So there's a lot more inter-milestones where you have to bring stakeholders together to make a decision, do we keep going or do we not? Which maybe on the surface also can seem like it's an administrative hassle, but you would argue that actually saves a lot of time and money and risk down. Like if you acknowledge and see it and make a decision early, you can save yourself a lot of work and hours by coming back a year later and knowing the solution didn't hit the mark.
You throttle up or throttle down, right?
I'll cover this quickly. I want to make sure we leave more time for questions. But I think it doesn't sound like there's a lot of disagreement at the way with source is changing, or how we're going to contract with our services providers in the next 5 years. We'll need to think about it differently. So, one is just talk about kind of a bit of a framework about how to think about it and how do you get started if you haven't started already. Right? I think one is around, okay, just what is our sourcing strategy? What are we sourcing to whom? I think we talked earlier about a lot of the transactional work should be automated away. That should be the expectation. Like that should be in the scope. You don't hope it happens. You don't hope to bring innovation, right? That has to be laid out in the contract. What does that mean? What does that cost? Who has ownership? I think as you get into sort of past the scoping and sort of some of the key strategic sourcing decisions, get into contracting, okay, what is the right metrics and mechanisms to put around it? Like Brian gave a great example of, hey, they had a strategic partner. This partner committed productivity, which was very competitive and something they probably couldn't have achieved by themselves. And yet, did they get the innovations they wanted? They didn't. So what is the mechanisms and gain sharing provisions you put in there to encourage them to disrupt themselves? But the reality is you still have people managing these processes, people that sit very far away and have a different way of working. And so you need to help these companies bring different parts of the organization together to get that innovation transformation you may be looking for. And you have to have it in writing, or it's not going to happen, right? I think the governance and what does that mean and who needs to be in the room for governance, right? I think you're moving away from the let's have a meeting once a month, let's admire SLAs, twice a year, let's get our executive stakeholders to get together and shake hands. Like, outside of maybe the first year of your contract when you're trying to stabilize, it has little value. And so start thinking about how do you push the envelope and how do you have those executive stakeholders have the right conversations, whether it's about new capabilities or managing risks or doing things differently. I mean, you guys might have seen over the last, this was actually very well publicized in the news, Genpact has announced several major contracts where they're completely transforming large banks' back office. Where not only is it coming in and giving you services or IT services or BPO services, they're saying, we're just going to own all of your back office, systems, and process, and we commit in 5 years to transform it with very clear financial outcomes. I think reading about these type of deals, you say, well, is this really going to work? We'll see. But a lot of really smart people and really well-respected companies put a lot of money after it. Sorry, John, we're going to say something?
No. Just one comment that automating those programs and outsourcing was a great idea. The challenge you face is we all hear about, concentration risk. Well, one of the things that we looked at in the financial industry was concentration risk. If your counterparty is being processed by the same company and they go down, you lose both sides of the transaction. As long as you have one side you can recreate, you lose both sides, you're out of business. So that's a new version of concentration risk. So in other words, Genpact may do it for JP Morgan, but if they're doing it for Citi and Citi is the other side of the transaction, they're going to be in trouble. But those are the kind of things that I think we need to do. And I think you hit a good point about you got to keep it going. You have to have this constant evaluation, constant review. And I know you have one more, and then we'll open up to a couple of questions because then we're going to break for lunch. So why don't you finish it out, and then we'll have a couple of questions. I know there are some out here.
Yeah, so the only last thing I want to talk about, and something nobody cares about, is pricing. The way these things are priced is going to have to change. Like I just gave examples of those Genpact contracts where literally thousands of people, business to front to back office. Like this is not a traditional RU type resource unit, right? Contract. This is more about what kind of outcomes you're going to achieve, how much money you're going to save me, how much more effective you're going to make me with my customers, and I'll give you a cut of that. Which I think for most of us, we're still fairly uncomfortable with these type of concepts, but we have to start thinking about that, and that's where how you encourage the value. So I just, at this point, let's open up for questions. I think we have a couple more slides, but I think the time may be better spent answering your questions.
So, Boris, do you guys look into the risk of not experimenting, not innovating, trying proof of concept? And I know that's relatively difficult to put a contract and pricing around, but either from the service provider or experimenting for the client or the client seeking business value through proof of concept, because you really don't know what the business value is going to be. Have you tried to measure the risk of not doing that, either with some of your clients or anyone in this audience trying to put some dollar value around risk of not doing this?
No, great question. And I would say we haven't quantified the risk per se, but if I was to sort of do some real-time calculation in my head, every single one of my clients complains about we're not getting enough innovation from our vendor. Like nobody's happy about it. Everybody says they brought the army into the room, they presented, they promised, they shook our hand, and we're not seeing it. We're getting the savings, we're getting the SLAs, not innovation, not new ideas. So to your point, is the risk high that you're not going to get it? Yes. I think that's a very common reflection I'm hearing. How do you get it? How do you put it right? I think, first of all, asking for innovation is not enough. You have to define what you mean by innovation. I think you have to be pretty clear. I think having clear contractual mechanisms, how you get that innovation, delivered and then measured. And that way you have that feedback loop. Innovation is all about feedback loop. Like not every innovative idea is going to be successful. In fact, majority will not. But making sure that it's coming and making sure that every month, whether it's quarterly, whatever time period is, you can have the conversation and see it. And to your point, we definitely see people taking the turn and saying, yes, I know I can get the operational efficiencies. Now I want you guys to help me transform.
And I think Boris said to add on to that, what we've learned is if it's not in the contract, if we don't get it detailed out, you don't have a way to measure it or a metric. You just don't, if it's not in the contract, not being measured, you don't have good governance on it, you don't get it at the end of the day. It's just all lip service, and behaviors just don't change. And that's the biggest thing that we've realized, out of all the learnings we've had, is as we're going in our next gen contract, trying to redefine a lot of the stuff that was on that pie chart, the slide before this one, is how do we incorporate all of that into driving the right behaviors, driving the right incentive, and making sure we have tight governance and controls in place to ensure it's being delivered. Because without that, you just won't get it.
Any other questions? Here you go. Can you just let me get?
Hi, no right or wrong answer here, but any thoughts on the best types of contracts to be drafted for agile dev work?
Nilesh, you want to provide your opinion?
Hi everyone, I'm Nilesh with PwC Strategy. So this is one of the topics that we've been talking about for the last few weeks. Just last night we were talking about it again, and I know we've had some interactions yesterday too. Couple of things that we're saying we need to think about is, what are you trying to get out of that contract at the end of the day? Let's define that. And I'm not talking about requirements, I'm talking about outcomes. Outcomes can be from an innovation perspective. Maybe you have an innovation cycle and you want certain ideas to go through that. You want to go through that. But let's define some of those outcomes. That could be one way. If you are already doing agile, one of the ways to think about it is, yes, I already have some ideas of what I want to get, but now I also want to have SLAs tied to what I am going to get. Maybe have some metrics around productivity, predictability. We're going to have certain number of user stories being delivered, story points being delivered. If they are not delivered, let's have a conversation about it as to what happened, but let's define some of those outcomes. And sure enough, again, you're not talking about requirements, but at this point, when I say story points, you may be a little more mature in the process that you have certain numbers already defined based on what the teams are doing. So based on what that outcome you're trying to achieve and what phase you are in, there may be a couple of different ways to think about agile contracts. I've seen a lot about, hey, I'm going to buy a Scrum team. That's the one thing I'm like, let's add some more. Yes, Scrum team, but what are they going to do at the end of 2 weeks or 4 weeks?
And I think to add that, there's two extremes. One extreme is, let's do complete time and materials. I'm going to pay you per hour. Give me some people, and I'll take all the risk advantage of those people. That's how most people get started. Probably not the best model. The other extreme is I've seen people say, I'm going to contract per sprint. Here's the outcomes of each sprint. So you're writing a new SOW every 3 to 4 weeks. Really administratively difficult, right? So this is where you have to have a little bit of trust, and you have to really know that there's a broader outcome, and you have to know, look, I'm not committing for 6 months of spend. I'm committing to an outcome and a common goal and a vision, and every month we're going to maybe do check-in, make sure we're heading in the right direction, and we're monitoring the output we're getting with certain agile metrics that you can measure to make sure the team is actually doing the right things versus just trust.
Kind of another point of view on that, though. Would you contract for waterfall? I mean, it kind of begs the question, what are we really trying to get to? Okay, agile is a means to an end. Really having a contract that's more aligned to what are you doing? Are you moving towards a more product-oriented strategy in the way you're approaching your portfolios and whatnot? And that's the sort of thing that you need to focus on in terms of your requirements and the outcomes that you're after. I think you're absolutely right. The outcomes are critical. But ask yourself the question, what are we really after? Are we after agile? Am I after Scrum people? Do I just need a great contract for hourly rates for Scrum Masters that are certified and whatever? Or are you trying to contract for a specific mode of delivery of applications development? Ask yourselves the questions. Where are we going as a business? What are the business outcomes I'm trying to get to? Because at the end of the day, the business, most of what the business is doing is IT enabled. Okay, they're really not interested in your sourcing contract, how well the sprints go, the types of reports. I have a product. I need. That's what I want.
Just add one more thing. Risk sharing and gain sharing. Great things to add into agile type contracts.
Yeah, I think that's where I was going for my question. I get the piece he's adding to component, but just what do you think would be best, whether it was outcome-based or you may just be looking at services delivery and not just you're implementing a waterfall project, right? But if you, I understand about story points, but I just want to gauge like the audience, any insights of what do you think has been most successful for your organizations?
Okay, good.
Yeah, with making sure that there's not scope creep,
So just and did you? I just want to make sure. Is it you specifically like what type of contracts?
What types of contracts, right? So I think that he just alluded to the
Risk sharing, gain sharing.
risk sharing and data sharing.
Right, because you're taking on more risk with these a little bit more open contracts without these defined requirements. You want to make sure that the supplier has some skin in the game. And if you're putting things such as business outcomes in there, they should be able to realize those business outcomes. And gain sharing is a great way for them to be incentivized for that.
I think just to add to that, I think it's not sort of the traditional fixed price or time and materials anymore. It's a hybrid, right? It's a lot more as time and material, but so you are adding metrics and you're adding gain share, and you keep the flexibility to stop anytime you need to. But it's also you have that. I guess it's a hybrid, right? Sorry.
I know you had a comment. So
Yeah, so real quick, so I know we're talking about a lot of change. How are we looking at improvement in the supplier management organization? So my question really is around how do you take the changes back to your real users in the business and across IT? And what would be the change management strategy to get that buy-in and make sure that everybody is following that process?
No, first of all, thank you for that question. That was one of the really things I wanted to make sure I leave this room with before. What I have learned through working with people for all time is really good. We have to keep this top of mind for people. And there's different levers you're going to pull based on the situation. But when we talk about risk sharing or automation, you have to have this top of mind for people to start thinking about this. Every solution, every SOW, every opportunity, am I pulling all the levers I can pull? So what we wanted to propose and encourage this organization to say, choose some targets. We'll put some sample one on the board. So take them back to your teams, to your organization. Say, hey, let's agree that for the next year, 25% of the contracts we write will have a considerable automation target in the contract, like spelled out. And if you're already there, makes it 75%, right? I don't think the actual metric is important. I think making sure it's just a top of mind for your teams, and whether you talk about risk, whether you talk about automation, whether you talk about are we doing enough risk sharing, we're challenging ourselves to either creative pricing models or given the right level of incentives for the vendor. Like, is this top of mind? It's not going to be applicable to every engagement, but if you're never asking the question, you're not going to get the benefits of it. Two.
All right, so I'll keep it short. Most of the people in the room I'm on the other side of the people that are in the room. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for Syrian Labs, one of the sponsors, and this is not a plug for a product. This is just to give you a perspective from the other side. Gain share, right? We have had numerous clients that conceptually love the idea of gain share. We have signed exactly 0 contracts with a gain share model. And based on my analysis of why that is there's a reticence from any client to go down that path and actually sign an agreement to give up savings or revenue gains. And I'm just telling you the realistic, what I see from my angle. And at the end, there's a revert back to, well, what is your pricing model that doesn't put you, where there's not a risk component? We're happy we're a smaller company, we're happy to go at risk, but it's just amazing. The larger the company, the more the reticence is to actually share the gain share. It is 2 things. There's gain, don't forget the share.
Yeah.
Well, you always got to remember the great conversations about when you take over a function. You take over a function and you go in, you have all these great ideas, and then somebody at a senior level says to you, remember, John, savings is the new revenue. So I'm not sharing my savings because I need to show that. So listen, it's been, we have another comment?
I was just going to add to Al's.
Sure, please.
that's the exact conversation we had. When we build our contract, we had all kinds of gain share provisions and language in it. We were scratching our heads like, do we just want to pay them to do the work? Because we don't want a windfall to come, whether it's 20%, 30%, 10%, whatever the number is you agree to share. But what happens if there's a windfall that comes out that you just missed? And do we really want to continue doing that? And then you get in the pros and the cons of, do we have the resources, or is it just better just to pay a fixed fee because we know there's opportunity there, and that way we can plan for it, we can project it, and we're not continuously writing checks, right, to infinity. So we struggled with exactly what you said, and what we landed is initially to get our feet wet with it and see how it worked, is we picked some areas where we just wrote it off. So we had a thing called under tolerance deductions. So if a customer takes a deduction, there's a certain dollar threshold that we just write it off. It's not worth our resource time to go solve it to scrounge up pennies. Those pennies add up, but we just made a conscious decision in our business at a certain dollar threshold, we're going to write it off. Well, our outsourcing partner, as they were performing the base services, they knew our policy and our procedure, and they were not going after and doing that. Then they came to us and they said, you guys have a business process to write off these deductions at this dollar threshold and below. Could we use this as a gain share opportunity so we can show you how it works, and it's no cost, no risk to you. You were writing it off anyways, and we've just been expanding that scope into other things. Under tolerance, over tolerance. We've been expanding what that bucket is because we just let that money on the table, and it's a positive P&L impact to us, and a lot of those pennies add up to dollars at the end of the day with very low risk. So I think the point is you got to find the right opportunity, and then once you figure out how that works, I think we're now more open. We're still going to have those debates and those challenges internally. We made it very clear nobody can sign a gain share deal without certain levels of approval, so you don't get somebody that just doesn't think it all the way through.
This point about risk and approval rights is critical. And they feel like they have the decision rights and their budget, much more open to doing gain share and taking some risk, because I feel like at the end of the day they can manage it. If you have to go up 3 chains of approvals and make a case that I want to do it, you say, you know what, I like the predictability, we're good, right?
Okay, well, listen, that was great, and I think that was a good finish. Let's hear it for Brian, Boris, and Micheal. Great job.